Hello, my name is Hugh Campbell. I'm Head of Architecture here in UCD. I wanted to welcome you to the new academic year, 2020 to 2021. And obviously, it's an academic year that's starting in very different circumstances. And what I want to do in this short video is to explain some of the measures and some of the precautions we're putting in place around the Richview campus to make it a safe and still enjoyable place for you to spend time, to learn, for us to teach during this academic year. I suppose, firstly, I just want to acknowledge that this campus has a lot of advantages in terms of the sorts of measures that are being put in place across the university sector as a whole. We have a lot of outdoor space. The space is largely occupied by students in our own school and indeed in architecture. There's outdoor connections between discrete and quite separate spaces. A lot of the spaces are well ventilated, either intentionally or sometimes unintentionally. We have high ceilings, etc. So all told, we're in a pretty good position to be able to continue to occupy and use those spaces, as well as the core spaces of the school, if you like, the studios and the lecture spaces and the workshop. There's also, of course, the very important resource of the Richview Library. The library will continue to operate. It will have a capacity of about 20. I believe that capacity is going to be confirmed very shortly. It will still be able to allow you to come in, to borrow books, to give books back, to look things up. All of the functions that you would associate with the library will still be available to you, albeit in a much more controlled manner. And I think you'll find that what's going to be happening across all of the spaces is that we need to exert a greater degree of control and management on those spaces. You won't have the same degree of flexibility and freedom that you have had before now in terms of coming and going. But putting those structures and that management of space in place is really what's going to make those spaces available to you and allow you to use them to maximum advantage. So a lot of the work that we've been doing in the build up to the semester is to maximize the use of all of the spaces that we have at our disposal. That includes, of course, outdoor spaces. And one of the things we already know throughout the course of lockdown and the pandemic is that outdoor space is really a great asset. And of course, everybody knows what it's like to congregate on these steps, and hopefully you will be able to continue to do so. But of course, keeping in mind the importance of social distancing at all times. The cafe will continue to operate. It will have a limited capacity. At the moment, I understand that capacity is as low as 6, but it will be able to serve the usual range of drinks and food that it has done up until now. I think the queuing will be managed in a slightly different way, but nonetheless, it's an important part of making sure that the life of the school can continue in the context of the sort of restrictions that we're working with. As we move from the cafe into the common room and associated spaces in the school, just a few general notes about moving around the building. In general, as you're moving around, you should be wearing a face covering, you should be wearing a mask. And that applies to any time that you're moving outside of a fixed teaching space. There will be sanitizing stations at entrances to buildings and at entrances to major teaching spaces. So please make sure that you get into the habit of using those. I'm sure you're already in these habits, but to continue those habits as you're coming into and moving through the building. As you move through the corridors and up through the stairs, you'll see that there's signage which is encouraging you to keep left at all times. So we're operating a system of circulation whereby you keep to the left-hand side, and that ensures a good degree of separation as you're moving around from room to room, from class to class. In general, the level of the occupancy of buildings is, we anticipated about 50% of what it usually would be. And that in turn obviously will reduce the amount of movement there's going to be in circulation spaces. The university protocols that have been developed have looked at 3 different kinds of contact, and we've used these in thinking about our own strategy. So the first kind of contact is passing contact, which is really the kind of contact that you have when you're moving through spaces, passing by each other in corridors or in the common room, as we see here. And those present a relatively low amount of risk, a level of risk. Casual contact is when you're spending less than 2 hours a day at a distance of 2 meters or more from colleagues, fellow students, and teachers. And that really covers, I think, all of our lecture-based subjects, some seminar-based subjects, and that will allow some of those subjects to have some amount of on-site teaching on the basis that kind of contact you'll have in those settings, which will be carefully managed with 2 meter distancing, will constitute casual contact. And then when we come to look at the studios, we'll talk about the final version of contact, which is sustained contact. And sustained contact relates to any contact you have for more than 2 hours a day, again, typically in spaces where you are maintaining 2 meter distancing. And this brings me to the studios, which are really at the core of our strategy for managing the COVID in RITU this year. So the studios, as you know, it's very important. The basis of our program is that every student has a space in the studio, and we want to maintain that for this coming year. So our idea is to make essentially pods within each of these studio spaces. So the way that we'll do that is, firstly, we will distribute student attendance across the week so that half of students will attend during one part of the week and the other half can attend in the other part of the week. Effectively, we're reducing capacity by 50%. 50% of students can be on site at any one time, the other 50% at alternative times. And those times and groupings will be explained to you by your studio module coordinators in the first days of the semester. In simple terms, what that will mean is that those who are in desks which are facing left will be in on one part of the week, and those in desks facing right will be in the second part of the week. Beyond that, then, we will also subdivide the studios with screens. So in this, for instance, the third year studio, there will be a division above head height running across, which will allow one set of students to occupy the space to the top end of the studio, and another independently to occupy the space in the bottom half of the studio, or in the bottom end of this space. So each studio space, typically in second year and in third year, will contain 2 discrete pods of about 8 students. And those pods are really, that's your team for the duration of the semester. Those are the group of students you're going to be working with in the studio, and then those will also be the group of students that you'll be taught with. So teaching will not happen in the studio spaces themselves. It will happen in smaller groups with 1 or 2 tutors in adjacent spaces. We have a schedule of booked spaces where you will attend tutorials and small group seminars and discussions on a timetabled basis on specific days of the week. Again, the details of this will be shared with you by your studio module coordinators, but the principle that we're operating really is that the studio is your workplace. We're treating you as workers, and that means that you're able to be in these spaces for quite prolonged periods of time at reasonable social distance and in these discrete pods. You will be asked to wear face coverings. At the moment, the advice is that you should be wearing visors. That advice is subject to change. It may be necessary to require the wearing of masks in the studios over prolonged periods. But at the moment, the advice is that we can use visors. Those visors will be supplied to you before you come into the studio or when you come in initially into the studio. and we would ask you please to wear them at all times. It's important to note that we're really relying on each other here to make this system work. We've thought this through, and we think we have a good system whereby we can have 50% occupancy and operate like that in a manner that is stable and safe. But it really does rely on you, the students, to buy into that system and to observe it carefully and to keep going with it. We're obviously in a situation which is pretty precarious, and we really want to avoid any incidences or outbreaks among our students. In the case of an outbreak, of course, the pod system means that in the first instance, only students in the particular pod where that outbreak occurs will not be allowed to attend, and the rest can continue working in the usual way. And as you'll know from your module coordinators, there are, of course, arrangements in place to allow students to attend remotely. So any students who have any difficulty with attending in studio, if you make that known to your module coordinators, you will be dealt with in an equivalent way. We're now looking at the fourth year studio, and in this case, we're also going to be working in the same system such that all students working facing left will be in on half of the week, and students facing right are in for the other half of the week. Again, we'll be subdividing, in this case, we'll be subdividing this larger space into 4 using screens, and we'll be opening up alternative entrances and exits to facilitate the maximum amount of separation, if you like, between those pods. Noting that, of course, casual contact, occasional passing contact, is not really an issue in terms of compromising the integrity of those pods. The beauty of this arrangement is that you will continue to have your own desk. You are not being asked to hot desk or to share space with anybody else. You will have your own desk, and then you come in and you work at it when you can. We've tried to arrange lecture and other activities such that it will be possible for you to spend maybe 2 days in the studio and then the next day involved in lectures. In other words, we've tried to rationalize our timetable as much as possible to allow for a shorter week on site. At the same time, the clear feedback that we have had from students is that it really is important to try to, within what is safe and reasonable and manageable, to maximize time in the studios. And so this is what we have worked to facilitate, again, as we move up into the final year studio. There'll be a similar arrangement here, students facing left in one part of the week, students facing right in the other. There's a teaching schedule that keeps time with that. And again, the idea is to facilitate the maximum amount of time on site. Just to reiterate, because teaching will only be happening typically on 1 day a week on site, at least some of the time you are going to be in charge of these spaces. So it really is going to be up to you to maintain the social distancing, to maintain those pods that we've established, and to keep the whole system going. Because if it does start to fall apart, then unfortunately we may be faced with moving back towards more remote teaching and reducing our capacity to attend on site. So I think that's a very important thing to stress. We will be receiving packs which include masks and sanitation supplies. These are issued centrally, and so we would also, of course, encourage you to use those and to observe the basic principles of keeping your distance, keeping your hands sanitized and washed, wearing face coverings, the usual sort of patterns of behavior that we've all become used to over the past months. just a note on the workshop. The workshop and the technicians in the workshop have done a lot of work in reconfiguring the space of the workshop to allow it to operate within the current conditions. As things stand, we have 12 workspaces available in the workshop. And those workspaces will need to be booked. We have to operate on a completely booked system. This goes back to this point that the spaces have to be more carefully managed and more consciously inhabited during this year. And so what this will mean is typically a pod of 8 will be able to use the workshop for a timetable slot, and that will typically be associated with particular studio modules. And then above and beyond that, there will be 4 other spaces which are sufficiently distant to allow them to be used by individuals who will book through an online booking system that we've developed specifically for this purpose. The usual requirements in terms of PPE and so on will be observed, obviously, in the lab, which means that for the most part you're going to be wearing a mask and goggles. You will need to supply these yourselves. Typically they have been supplied by the lab in the past, but that won't be possible for this year for reasons which are obvious. So everybody will have to bring their own gear when they come to work in the lab. Priority will be given then to different studios at different years at different points across the semester, but then we have those 4 spaces available for those who are keen to use the workshop, and they can obviously do that through the booking system. The laser cutters will operate pretty much as usual. There's a booking system, as there always has been. There's 2 laser cutters, and John O'Shea, one of the technicians, will be in that space with the laser cutters to manage operations. There'll also be an ante room to that space where you can wait until your turn comes and you can prepare your material and so on. In terms of use of the computer room, which I don't have footage of, unfortunately, or the printers and plotters, with the computer room there will be reduced capacity, but we believe we can allow 6 and perhaps 8. We need to get the final estimate on that to use the space. There will be wipe down covers on the keyboards, but we're asking students, as students are being asked across campus, to please wipe down the devices after they have used them to allow the next student to come along and use them safely. The same will apply to the use of plotters and printers. We anticipate a somewhat reduced use of these because a lot of the teaching will involve screens, but nonetheless, when you're using these printers and plotters, again, after use, please make sure that you wipe them down so that the next student can come along and use them safely. As I refer to, the teaching will be happening at or removed from the studio spaces. So while you will be able to spend quite a lot of time in the studio, your tutors will be meeting you in separate spaces. And typically speaking, those meetings will take place with 2-meter social distancing. The use of visors is likely in those meetings, and a lot of the meetings will take place through the medium of a shared screen. So we will be asking you to show your work on a monitor, and then the tutors will be able to discuss your work with you and will be able to mark it up through the use of pads on the monitor. There will also obviously be the possibility of pinning up drawings in more, let's say, usual manner. So you pin up drawings and then you sit back, and then a tutor can look at the drawings and discuss them with you. What we've tried to prioritize in terms of our teaching are the kinds of things that are the most difficult to reproduce online. So in studio teaching, we felt that meant particularly the sort of small group interactions and tutorials that are quite hard to replicate in the world of online teaching. In lectures, there's some variety of approach across our lecture modules. A number of lecture modules will be entirely online with recorded lectures and then more interactive timetable sessions. Some lectures will take place on site with smaller groups of students, alternating between groups of students. All lectures will be available remotely, either through live streaming and or recording, so they will be available after the fact. And again, the idea is to try to maximize the quality of your learning and of the environment that we're able to provide for you, while still observing the necessary safety precautions. So all the lecture spaces we'll be using, which typically will be G80 in Newstead, and the Memorial Hall will be set up to allow for safe distancing. And of course, because lectures will typically take about 50 minutes, there's opportunities to go out of the space, take a break, and then come back in. And this will minimize any risk involved with these kinds of sessions. Overall, then, from what you've seen and heard, I suppose you'll understand that this is still Richview. It's still the familiar environment, but it's going to be a slightly different environment this year, inevitably so. We hope, nonetheless, that being able to be in this environment will add a lot to your experience, as it always does, and we hope that you will work with us to make sure that we can maintain and manage the sort of practices and procedures that we've carefully put in place to try to make sure that we can stay safe and stay open and stay operating throughout the academic year. Of course, your experience need not be limited to Richview. You will, of course, be able to move over to the main campus, albeit in a campus which will be subject to a number of the same kind of restrictions as we've talked about in this short presentation. There'll be more updates throughout the year, but for now, I would simply again ask you to join us in making this a safe and enjoyable and fulfilling academic year. Thank you very much for listening.